Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. As we begin each literary movement, each little era that we'll be moving through, we'll begin it with an overview PowerPoint presentation to kind of put it in its historical context. Always tell folks when we look at literature, right, we have to think about its history because literature is a reflection of its times. So, the time we're moving into is that immediately after the Civil War and up to the First World War. And this is known as realism. And some of the different parts of realism that we'll take a look at is regionalism, local color, as well as naturalism. So we begin with the Civil War. The impact of the Civil War is really hard to understate. It transformed our country politically, economically, as well as socially. What's interesting part about the Civil War is that it stimulated a whole lot of different technologies to happen, as well as sparked industrialization. So this is going to be important to remember that after the Civil War, right, those innovations with different technologies, industry, it doesn't stop, it's going to continue. What we see after the Civil War is we enter into Reconstruction. And with the assassination of President Lincoln, right, he had a different plan for Reconstruction than what happened. So Congress called for harsh penalties on the South, and this is when, in the American South, we enter into what were called carpetbaggers and scallywags. Carpetbaggers, those were profiteers from the North who came down to the South. They're called carpetbaggers because they carried a bag that looked like it was made out of carpet to hold their possessions. And then scallywags. A scallywag was a Southerner who worked with the North to impose the different penalties for Reconstruction. So if you ever heard those terms, carpetbagger or scallywag, goes all the way back to Reconstruction, those times after the Civil War. The 14th Amendment was passed. This is when the enslaved became U.S. citizens. And the resultant backlash in the South, this is the time of the Jim Crow laws, as well as hate groups begin and start to spread. So there's some good things going on in America, as well we have some bad things going on. This is also the time in our history where immigration literally just takes off like a rocket. There's the Statue of Liberty right there outside of New York City. We get that from France, by the way. It's a good Jeopardy answer. So during this time, from the Civil War to World War I, 25 million immigrants. And if you look at the growth of cities up north, the population is just exploding in New York City and Chicago. So how does this, tie in with the previous slide? Well, remember we talked about industry and technology, and now we have all these laborers coming in, right? Really cheap labor. So now everything's just going to continue to grow and grow and grow with technology and industry, right? So all that labor, boom. So what happens? We have the Transcontinental Railroad. This is really, really important. Before the Transcontinental Railroad, if you wanted to go from east to west or west to east, right, you had to, ride a horse or, a wagon trail that would take a long, long time, or get on a boat and go all the way around South America to get to the opposite coast, which would take a long time, and it was really, really dangerous. But now East and West is connected, so the American country becomes smaller due to travel times, right? We can travel now. Wow, 1876, we have the telephone. 3 years later, we have the light bulb. So what's the significance of this? Well, life becomes more and more advanced. It's starting to take on features that we're familiar with, right? Just picking up the phone and calling someone, electric light, things that we're familiar with, the people during this time also have. And this is important because before this, life was really, really different, right? No phones, travel times really, really long. When it was dark, you went to bed. But now we're kind of moving closer and closer to what we'll eventually call the modern time. So, in English class, what is our purpose is? Well, our purpose is to talk about literature. Fiction becomes the dominant genre in realism during the time in between the Civil War and World War I. By genre, that's different categories. For example, poetry, drama, there'd be different genres, and that fiction becomes the dominant genre. Magazines become incredibly popular. For example, the Saturday Evening Post, as well as Harper's Weekly that we see here. A really, really fascinating part of realism is that we have an incredible expanse of authors. Women, I know, women become published authors and start to make money just from writing, as well as African Americans, something that in the previous years in American literature didn't happen. This is also when we have what's called the serial or serializations. So what would happen is that an author would publish a novel chapter by chapter in a magazine such as Harper's or the Saturday Evening Post. One chapter each issue. And then, right, she would get paid or he would get paid, right, for each installment. Then, after all the different chapters were published, then the author would publish that novel again, but in complete form, and make more money. So what's the importance of this? More and more people are reading, are having a reason to read, and are making money off writing. So we're going to have to see more and more people are going to get pulled into this. So we're going to have a tremendous cycle moving upward of literacy, which in any country, any society is a good thing. And as we've mentioned before at the first slide, realism is this period. So the guiding force that we'll see is realism. And a good way to understand realism is to look at it in terms of moving from the old to the new. The period immediately before realism, today we call romanticism. It had its emphasis upon the imagination, improbable plots, and unreal settings. So you can look at some of the authors featured here: Walt Whitman, Edgar Poe, and Emily Dickinson. Right? Imagination, improbable plots, like having a raven that says nevermore. That'd be a good example. The romantic authors, they wrote today what we call subjectivity. That's when the writers gave their own perspective. For example, in Walt Whitman's Song of Myself, we saw through Whitman's eyes. Or when encountering a poem of Emily Dickinson with its strange capitalization and the use of the dash, right, if you remember that, we saw the world through her eyes. And as well, romantic authors appeal to emotion, very sentimental. But now we're going to see things change as we move into realism. Some of the different authors we see here are W.E.B. Du Bois, Kate Chopin, and of course Mark Twain, perhaps the most famous realist even today. The authors of realism insist on the commonplace, the probable, and the ordinary, which is the direct opposite of what was going on in romanticism. These authors as well, instead of subjectivity, they'll be dealing with objectivity. What objectivity refers to is treating things as they really are. So instead of looking at things through the author's eyes, the author is going to remove herself or himself and try to portray it as well as possible. And this is what we call verisimilitude. And we'll talk about verisimilitude more and some of the other features of realism, in the next lecture.